lectures, when you're analyzing the notebooks, you mentioned about the walks through the city and the one scene which you took an excerpt that he saw a child breathing in the foul smells of the hospitals and the anxiety.
Right.
You connected that to the biopolitical, but my question is the questions of space. In the idea that you were talking about that he's meant from the outskirts coming to the city, and how does that entail in the modernistic discourse of the anxiety and the biopolitics?
Right. Yeah, I guess what part of what I try to do in the book is to, in a certain sense, de-emphasize the importance of the city, which is, it seems like a perverse thing to do with this book, which is considered to be one of the first great urban novels in the German language. At the same level, although not as elaborate as as Joyce, as Ulysses. So my worry has been that in focusing on the city, you're then pushed into in a way into an understanding of the novel as being about shock experience, and basically the perceptual apparatus, overwhelmed. So it almost pushes you in a psychophysical dimension. And there's a lot of language in the novel that seems to be about someone from the country, is used to peace and quiet and the sound of dogs barking and chickens, roosters crowing, comes into the city and is overwhelmed by too much stimulation. So it's the German. Freud, Benjamin analyzes shocks, and he uses Freud from Beyond the Pleasure Principle, this notion of shock experience, and Reiz. The word for stimulation is Reiz, and Freud talks about the ego as a Reizschutz, as a protection against stimulation. So it's easier to read the novel and other modern texts as being about the breakup, the loss of the protection, ego protection, or the attempt to harden, create almost a shield of to protect us. And it's very clear for me from the novel that that the recollections from Malta's, the protagonist's childhood, that he's already experiencing the kinds of anxieties in this collapsing aristocratic family. In other words, something is happening, I would say, to the master discourse. There's a collapse of the structure of a social link. The city is a place where that collapse is in a way accelerated and concentrated, but the anxiety is already present in the country. And I think if you see the novel as being about something that happens with urbanization, I think you lose touch with the genealogy I've tried to trace, which is that of political theology, and in a certain sense, the breakdown of the master discourse. The Lacanian notion of the discourse of the master, and that is not something that you can't say that is simply something that happens because of urbanization, and so that's why I try to distance myself a little bit, de-emphasize the dimension of space, and try to look at this more diffuse process that's already happening in Malta's childhood, and there are resonances of this process already happening in early modernity, because the king is always endangered to be, decomposed, deposited, entsetzt. And now that process of entsetzen, of divestiture, suddenly, basically the evacuation of value, you could say, of bodies, that now belongs to everyone. Sort of the rise and fall of value.
Can I because when you gave the presentation, I wanted to ask you about this, because yes, it belongs to everybody, but nonetheless it's structured and articulated in particular ways which are profoundly unequal, and actually expose certain people, certain bodies, certain forms of flesh to power.
Absolutely.
In the UK, for example, a very simple example, the Queen, in theory, could not be prosecuted for a crime because she is still the sovereign exception that determines the rule. Now that suggests to me something perhaps a little less, you used the term diffusion or diffuse. It suggests to me something perhaps the UK is the exception to the rule. But something that's not perhaps diffusion, but slightly different.
Well, in other words, the way I would put it is that the various attempts to sort out, good and bad flesh, the flesh that makes you people with a capital P as opposed to the people with a small p, is basically an attempt to respond to the pressure that is diffuse. And this is one of the ways that we do it. And you could say that even, let's say, the privileged, let's say, well, let me put it this way. When we think about the security state after 9/11, the people who have used the Agamben typically point to Abu Ghraib, to Guantanamo. This is where the state of exception has become the rule. And when the state of exception has become the rule, Agamben does this. He says, what are the people reduced to? They're reduced to bare life. On the other hand, once you accept the security state, you've accepted that the highest value for you is bare life. So in a certain sense, obviously there's a huge disparity, there's a huge difference between those who are in Guantanamo and everyone else. And I think Agamben is maybe too quick to say we all, but in a certain sense, we've embraced those who are,
You called this democratization, you called it democratization, and I wondered about the use of that term as well.
Just in the sense that the principle of sovereignty now is basically the bearer of sovereignty is at least officially the people, and so the exposure to the dilemmas of the bearer of sovereignty, basically what could happen to a king, in a way, the fragility of that investiture, the privileges of it, but the absolute fragility of it. Now is something that I think is widely dispersed, and one of the ways in which we manage that fragility is to sort out those who are more exposed to it and those who at least imagine that they are not exposed to it, that they are not, their bodies are not subject to just the return to the flesh.
It made me think. Your lecture made me think of, when you mentioned Benjamin in particular, of Poe's story, The Man of the Crowd, which is a story I'm always fascinated by. You might say it's the first stalking story, or Benjamin talks about it as the first, almost the first film, because as somebody who is suddenly immersed in the shock of the crowd. But what I liked about your reading of the Rilke novel, which I don't know, is that it suggests that you could read the Poe story in the same way, that actually it's not about the urban environment, despite the arguments of numerous kind of sociological critics. It's about that kind of connection between two people, kind of the other, removed from, as you say, there's this world of the kind of the symbolic skin, which is kind of flayed in a sense at that particular moment. Right.
So, and again, there's something that gets lost if you think about crowds as almost as too tangibly, too materially, just as this aggregation of strangers, anonymous strangers, the pressures, almost the spatial pressures the anonymity, all those things, that's all true. But there's something about mass, the word mass, that to me suggests also something more visceral, something metastasizing, that that again has to do with a virtual reality that is now carnally shared by the mass. And again, one has to then manage it and administer it and protect against it and sequester, keep it away, keep it at bay, defend against it. But it's now everywhere. In a way, that's the problem. You can't. And that's why you then have these pressures to act out.
Yeah. Well, the obverse of that is what happened in the UK after the bombings in July a few years ago, when this young Brazilian man, Demenezes, was shot on the tube. But what's happened in the years subsequent to that is that nobody has been held as culpable for the shooting of him, because the police had been authorised to use what they deemed to be extreme force that was needed when they needed to. And what that opens up is the extraordinary vulnerability of any one of us to the very possibility of the exercise of these forms of sovereign power, even as we claim to be the sovereign. And this is perhaps the irony. The distribution of sovereign power in very odd ways, in which the people are sovereign, and yes, as sovereign, the people are subject to the risk that the sovereign can make you exempt, the exception, in order to protect the people.
Well, it's like, I mean, it's one of the early chapters in Kentorowicz's book, The King's Two Bodies, is on Richard II, and the whole discussion focuses on his deposition by Bolingbroke, and it's like suddenly, and he describes the passage from the king to basically flesh.
Yeah. Which King Lear traces as well.
Yeah, exactly. So in a way, and what I think Kantorowicz does too quickly, he assumes that what remains at the end of this deposition, he calls it a cascading movement, is basically just the body. And what I think, it's basically the residue of his sovereignty. It's in a way the symbolic investiture at the zero level, and that's what flesh is. It's a symbolic value at the zero level. So it's more than body, but just a fraction. You know.
Well, for me, there's that great moment in Lear where he stands when he's blindfolded, and he stands at what he thinks is the edge of the cliff when all his authority is finally gone, and he jumps, thinking that finally he will just be mere body. But actually, he jumps and he's still alive. He lands in just a. And he turns around and says, "No, you're still here."
Yeah. Well, he's the royal remains.
He's the royal remains, quite literally at that point. Yeah.